Hey everyone, and today we're going to talk about Crossplane v2, the new major version of Crossplane. So my name is Scott Rosenberg, Global SI. I'm the lead architect in the CTO office at TerraSky, and let's talk about Crossplane. So quick overview, what is Crossplane, right? Crossplane is the cloud-native control plane. It really allows us to provision, to manage all of our resources. It brings the paradigm of Kubernetes to everything, basically, making it extremely powerful. One of the great capabilities we can do is we can actually compose a lot of resources together using this idea of an XRD and a composition, where we can define an API and then compose together all of our resources into user-facing APIs that really make sense for our end users. And this allows us to offer self-service for our end users. Now, Kubernetes is an amazing control plane for containers, as mentioned, and really Crossplane is how do I extend that out to basically anything that has an API, be that the public cloud, be that vSphere or KubeVirt or any on-prem solution, be that a Grafana dashboard, really whatever we want. The methodology of control planes has existed for years in the cloud providers. What Crossplane is doing is democratizing that and giving all of us the capability to build that control plane ourselves. So when we talk about building our own platform API in Crossplane v1, we had this idea of our XRD, right, which is our definition. That's my API. From there, that created two different resources for us. That created a claim, which was a namespace scoped API resource, and then we had the cluster scope that was basically a mirroring of one another. You created a claim, that created in the back end automatically the cluster scoped XR. An XRD has one or more implementations of that interface, which are called compositions. A composition comes and is picked up by the XR, and we get a bunch of managed resources that get deployed. An RDS instance, a DB subnet, a security group, right? Obviously, if this was really AWS, we would be talking somewhere around 70 to 80 actual resources to create an RDS instance, but that's a whole nother story. Now, when we actually look at how this works, the claim is namespace scoped, everything else is cluster scoped. And this really brought a bunch of complexity to it. We had number one, the cluster scope managed resources, which was really kind of modeled after the idea of a persistent volume and a persistent volume claim. But this caused these weird and awkward isolation boundaries. It was very hard to necessarily allow a developer to debug what's going on with something, because I don't want to give him access at the cluster level. Right? So this caused a bunch of challenges, and the claim to XR, kind of conversion and mapping just caused a bunch of excessive complexity. And if we take a look at what Crossplane v2 does, we've greatly simplified this. We now have the composite, which creates a bunch of deployed resources, we're calling them here. Why? Because it can be a managed resource from a provider, but it can also be a non-Crossplane resource, which we'll get into in a moment. But we just have our composite resource, and that can be either namespaced or cluster scope depending on our use case. So really allowing the freedom for you to decide at what scope do you want to expose your APIs. Now, there was also what I would define as the poor application support in v1, right? Crossplane v1 had not the greatest application support in the sense that it focused mostly on infrastructure. Most of the examples were AWS, Azure, Google, things like that. How do I spin up a database, things like that. And there was no direct support for non-Crossplane managed resources. That means I needed to use these wrapper providers, the Kubernetes provider or the Helm provider, or all these different providers to allow me just to create a deployment in Kubernetes, which made it way more complex than it needed to be in many cases. And this is where, in Crossplane v2, we have a way less opinionated stack, which allows us to compose any resource out of a composition. This can be a deployment, a service, or any CRD we want. This could be Cloud Native Postgres if I wanted, or any other operator CRD that I would like. And it really allows us to build these control planes for applications really easily, right? Which is an extremely powerful capability. Another one was in v1 we had this excessive resources issue, right? This has been coming with us for a long time. The initial AWS providers had over 900 CRDs. Certain cloud providers, starting with G, it could crash their API servers often. When you would install certain providers, just the amount of CRDs until it would come back up and scale automatically, and we had challenges with this. This was solved initially by breaking up the providers into family providers. But what ended up happening, and this is the real power now in Crossplane v2, is we have this idea of limiting the CRD bloat by having these, what we call MRAPs, or Managed Resource Activation Policies, which allow us to say, hey, while I'm installing this provider, I only need access to these 3 CRDs from this provider, which has 50 CRDs. Only install these 3 for me. So we have the ability to dynamically say what I want to use and have that installed in my cluster, instead of needing to just install the entire EC2 API group into my cluster when all I need is EC2 instance. So this really gives us a lot of flexibility and lowers the load on our API server. There are a bunch of new features as well. But I'd say the key ones that really matter are we have the ability to now generate Crossplane providers using Upjet for almost any Terraform provider. Upjet is how most providers are created, which allows us to take a Terraform provider and easily convert that into a Crossplane provider. The issue is that there's the Proto v6 of Terraform, which is a different protocol that Terraform providers or Open Tofu providers are built off of, and that didn't work with Upjet. It now does in Crossplane v2. The biggest one, though, is the Terraform plan-like capabilities. We have the ability now to do with Crossplane diff, which is very similar, that same capability, and we get the reconciliation observability with observed generation on everything. It is backwards compatible, which is very important. Basically, everything is backwards compatible unless you were using deprecated features, so just don't use deprecated features. And there's a bunch of resources here for the docs. There was also a big revamping of the docs, making them extremely powerful and way easier to follow. And this has really made Crossplane such an easy project to get started with. And yeah, would love to talk to anyone outside if anyone has any questions, and get started with Crossplane v2. It's never been easier or more fun to get started with. So thank you.